Hi everyone. This morning I am absolutely thrilled to have Professor Layman as my guest. So Professor Layman's been to New Zealand a couple of times, so today we invite him for his third visit virtually. So welcome to New Zealand, Professor Layman.
Good to be back, even virtually.
Even if you are in isolation in Chicago. So Professor Layman is currently a Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois, and he's a nutrition consultant with the food industry. Is that correct? He's got a really impressive research and teaching history, over 100 peer-reviewed publications, many awards. It's a very long biography, so we will put a list of all that on my website and in the show notes. So Professor Layman is considered the godfather of protein research, and so I'm really delighted.
That implies I'm really old, right?
That you know lots and lots about protein. So I'm delighted you're going to talk to us about that today. I feel over my career as a nutritionist, protein has been really misunderstood and becoming quite vilified today. So it would be really nice to put some of those things to rest. So, Professor Layman, to start off, would you talk about what protein is, what it does in the body, and why it's an essential macronutrient?
Yeah, I think that really is a good place to start. Protein is actually just a food. I always like to use the example that it's like saying we need a vitamin pill. We don't really need the pill. What we need are the 12 vitamins in the pill. And with protein is really just a food source of amino acids. And we need 20 amino acids, and proteins contain that. And of those amino acids, 9 are considered essential, which means the body can't make them at all. We have to have them in a diet, just like a vitamin pill. And what we know is that animal proteins basically have a much better distribution of those amino acids than plant proteins. So basically, we're trying to get the right mix and the right amount of those 9 essential amino acids. And that's what really helps us build body proteins, enzymes, structures, everything that goes on in the body starts with protein.
Okay, and you've done quite a lot of research into how much we need, why we need that much. There's things like the metabolic signaling aspects of proteins. So we've got things like leucine threshold, but also metabolic signaling for brain and gut and, other things as well. So that helps determine how much we should be eating.
Yeah, the amount of protein that we need, we think of it now as a range of intake. And at the very minimum level, which we call the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, which is set at 0.8 grams per kg, what that does is supply enough of the protein so we get amino acids to help build new proteins. But as you're suggesting, there are a lot of other roles of these amino acids. One of them is leucine, which triggers protein synthesis, particularly in muscle. Another one is tryptophan, which is a neurotransmitter. It's a precursor to serotonin in the brain. And you can go on. Lysine is another one that is a precursor to a compound known as carnitine, which is basically how we transport fats into our cells to burn them. And so each of these amino acids have other metabolic roles. And the difference is those metabolic roles don't really get going until we have a higher level of protein. So we can meet the minimum need just for kind of building blocks of protein, but all these other signaling and metabolic roles require a higher protein diet.
So what are the other things that protein does in our body? Like we all understand that it's involved in, you know, muscle maintenance and muscle synthesis, but, you know, what are the other things? I mean, it's the precursor to pretty much everything, isn't it?
Yeah, so like I said, each of the amino acids have different roles. I mean, another one is like arginine is a precursor for nitric oxide, which controls blood pressure and vasodilation of the arteries. So every one of them has other roles. The one that I personally have studied the most is the leucine trigger in muscle. And it basically regulates how and when the muscle goes into an anabolic period, building new muscle. And it's interesting that that changes with age. When we're young, that process of building new muscle is really driven by hormones. So children kind of grow because of hormones, insulin, growth hormone, IGF-1. But once we stop growing and we get into our 30s and on into the 40s, now muscle is really controlled by the quality of the diet. And so the amount of protein and specifically the amount of leucine at each meal determines whether muscle stays healthy or not. And we've been researching that now for the last 20 years. And we pretty much understand that, and we understand that we need about 30 grams of protein per meal. We need about 3 grams of leucine within that protein to keep our muscles healthy. So it's just we're evolving at how we understand protein, and particularly how we understand it for adults.
So you mentioned that the RDA is about 0.8 grams per kg of body weight. What would your recommended protein, doses be? Would you want to go higher than the RDA?
Oh yes, the research is absolutely clear that for adults, you can always see health benefits of being above 1.0. So almost all of the recommendations for adults now are that they should fall between 1.0 and 1.8 grams per kg, so double the RDA. I always recommend 1.2 to 1.6 is the range I always recommend. So we know that to maintain muscle health, to maintain bone health, that you need substantially above the RDA for adults.
And how would somebody work out whether they should be closer to the 1.2 or 1.6 level? What would determine how you choose that?
The other main factor that relates to it, the other two main factors that relate to it are your age, and the other one is your physical activity. So as you get older, we know that your metabolic efficiency goes down. So you probably need a higher protein diet. You need to continually shift. You need fewer calories as you get older, but you actually need more protein, or at least higher quality protein. And the other is physical activity, particularly resistance exercise. We know that resistance exercise can help blunt the losses of aging, muscle losses. So if you're physically active, resistance exercise in your 40s, you can be at the low end of that range. As you get toward your 60s, if you're more sedentary, you should get to the higher part of that range.
Right, because there's quite a bit of misunderstanding, I think. Older people think they need less protein.
Yeah. The obvious thoughts forever was, well, growing children need more protein because obviously they're growing, but that's not the point at all. That growth only accounts for about 5 to 10 grams of new protein per day. If you look at a 10-year-old or a 16-year-old, the fastest rates of growth, they're only depositing about 5 or 10 grams of new protein per day. But whether you're 16 or 65, you have to replace 250 to 300 grams of protein every day just to stay alive. New enzymes in your liver, new enzymes for your digestive tract, replacing muscle proteins, 250 grams a day. And what I said a minute ago, as we get older, it's that replacement and repair that is the aging process. We get less efficient at it. And we know that we can blunt that, and we call the term for that is anabolic resistance. As we get older, we are less able to repair and replace proteins. But we know that the two things that can blunt that effect are resistance exercise and more protein.
So for older people, you're definitely recommending getting out there and lifting some weights.
Yeah, we need resistance, or I mean, yoga, it's about stretch against resistance. So yoga is great. You can use rubber bands, you can lift weights, you can go to the gym, but something that, getting up and down out of a chair, walking stairs, all kinds of things are resistance exercise. But as we're doing, sitting in front of a computer is not exercise.
Oh, that's great recommendations. So I had a question, it's just slipped my mind, but it'll come back. So we're talking somewhere maybe between 90, to 120 grams of protein per day for most people. And so we're going to divide that up into meals. How does that work? You mentioned before that we need 30 grams per meal to get our 3 grams of leucine. So how are we going to distribute that? What happens if we don't get that 3 grams of leucine? What happens to that protein that we may have eaten?
Sure, good question. The first thing to do is to separate children from that. Children, again, are driven by hormones, and so they can eat very small amounts. They could have a breakfast meal that maybe only has 10 grams of protein in it, and they'll grow perfectly fine because their processes are being driven by hormones. Adults, once we're no longer being driven by hormones, now the diet quality comes into effect. What we have discovered was that to trigger in the protein complex in muscle that regulates this is all called mTOR. Your listeners probably haven't ever heard of it. I think you probably have. But anyway, it's a complex, sort of like the master control complex in every tissue, but particularly in muscle. And it's sensitive to various things. It's sensitive to leucine, the amino acid, insulin, exercise, energy, lots of different things. What we discovered is that it absolutely has a requirement for leucine of somewhere around 3 grams. And 2.5 is kind of the minimum. And so using that and looking at the American diet, which is about 70% animal protein and 30% plant protein, that gives us a leucine content of the protein at about 8%. And so if you're after 2.5 grams of leucine, it takes 30 grams of protein to get to it. That's where that number comes from. And that's the absolute minimum. So my recommendation is that adults should have at least 2 meals per day that are more than 30 grams, someplace between 30 and 55 grams of protein. And it should be at the minimum the first meal of the day and perhaps the last meal of the day, which gives you the biggest anabolic effects. You'll see a lot of things out there. People will talk about even distributions and things like that. And that's not the point. The point is how many meals per day do you get where you exceed that minimum 30 gram number? And I think for most healthy adults, they need to do it at least twice.
Okay, so then that's about 60 grams. So if they're only hitting 30 grams, that's 60 grams per day. So
right.
Still a little
and so my personal approach is that at my first meal of the day, and I usually avoid trying to call it breakfast because it's not the time of the day, it's what the first meal is. My first meal is around 45 grams, and my last meal is around 55. So there I've got 100, and my middle meal is usually pretty light, maybe 20. So there's my 120.
Right. So how do people who are doing intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating deal with this? Do we need to have a certain time gap between consuming the protein, or can we eat it in a compressed time frame?
Yeah,
Sorry, so we were talking about
intermittent fasting, or time associated. So again, when I talk about protein in meals, I avoid using the term breakfast because I want people not to be sensitive to the time so much. So the purpose of time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting is to reduce the calorie intake. Most adults have decreasing calorie needs. We're not super physically active. As we get older, our calorie needs go down. So the question is, how do we control that calories? And one way is just simply eating fewer meals. And so I frankly try to limit my meals to 2 per day. That's my goal. Then I want the first meal that I eat, I want it always to be high protein and generally low carbohydrate, because that first meal, you're coming out of a fast. Your body is burning fats, and you're also catabolic. You're breaking down muscle tissues and tissues in general. So the content of that first meal determines your metabolism. So I want it to be high protein to kick the body into a recovery mode. So we're generating new proteins. And I want it to stay in a fat burning mode. So I don't want it to be high carb, which triggers insulin and shuts down fat burning. So that first meal, I think, is very important to your overall health and your metabolic flexibility. Time restricted, basically, you can have whatever, 6 hours or whatever, and your last meal of the day is also high protein. So that, I think it fits fine. Intermittent fasting, people interpret that in different ways. I'm not a big fan of older adults fasting. I think that, up until your mid 40s, I think the body will handle that okay. But when you go into a fast, even as short as 36 to 48 hours into a fast, your body starts breaking down protein. And we know from lots of bed rest studies that as you get older, when you break down protein, the body is very inefficient at recovering it. And so I don't think older adults, again, over mid 40s, should really do fasting. We hear people talk about fasting for cleanses and all of that. I think that's total nonsense and frankly very dangerous for older adults.
I think, Dr. Fung's done a lot of work, but I do think sometimes that gets a little bit misunderstood because he's working with really metabolically sick people, extreme diabetes. He's trying to stop people from having their legs amputated and going blind. And we sort of extrapolate that out into everybody should be doing this, I think, and, things become fads and then they come and go.
I'm not sure I totally understood your point. Are you talking about a really low carb diet, or I'm sorry?
Well, I was talking about, so Dr. Fung, are you aware of Dr. Fung? He does the intermittent fasting. So he runs an intermittent fasting clinic, and he's very popular with fasting. And I mean, he's great. I mean, he does great work. But I think it does get extrapolated out into the general population rather than,
The data, the research with intermittent fasting and time-restricted fasting is pretty positive, but the effect of it is basically calorie restriction. So it is just another tool to help people. I mean, what the data from all sorts of labs have shown is that if you restrict or fast, you will tend to overeat at the next meal, but not enough to make up for what you skipped.
Right.
And so the net effect is you eat less calories. I think that any strategy that allows you to eat less calories is worth considering. So I don't have any problems with it, but anyone who thinks there's a magical property to it is just being silly. I mean, there's nothing magical about it. It's a calorie balance issue.
And so really we should be prioritizing our protein calories and then looking at our fat and our carbohydrate calories to control that energy intake.
One of the things that I think nutritionists have made a huge mistake is over the years, we've begun to talk about macronutrients as percentage of calories. And we talk about carbohydrates as 50% or fats as 30% and protein is 15, which kind of minimizes protein. But the reality is protein is the only essential macronutrient and it's related to body weight. So you have to design your diets around protein first and then layer in fat and carbohydrates based on the metabolic outcome and the calories you want. So basically, every meal should start first with a protein decision. And if you're going to make a decision to be high protein, that's fine. If you make a decision to be vegan, that's fine. But then you also have to realize that you have an absolute requirement for resistance exercise, or you're going to have sarcopenia and osteoporosis. You're going to have loss of lean body mass as you get older.
So, the vegan protein decision is quite interesting. I mean, there are a few plant foods that are complete in essential amino acids, aren't there? You've got soy.
Actually not.
Oh, none?
There are no plant proteins that are fully adequate. They're all limiting. So by definition of complete, every protein contains all the essential amino acids. There is no protein that doesn't, with maybe the exception of collagen. Okay, so everyone contains all the essential, but they're not in the right balances. Every plant protein is limiting in one or more of the essential amino acids. The critical ones are lysine, methionine, tryptophan, and leucine. Every plant is low in one or more of those. Plants will be considered adequate. For example, quinoa, everyone's superfood of a few years ago, has 6.0% leucine in it. So to get to your leucine requirement at a meal, having 3 grams of leucine in a meal would require 7 cups of quinoa. Yeah. Okay, so it's adequate. It meets the FAO, the World Health Organization's guideline for a protein, but is incredibly limiting. And so it's a lot of that data, a lot of those terms have been developed by the food industry to mask the fact that plant proteins are always inferior to animal proteins.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear you talk about that, because I did a little exercise some time ago where I looked at a range of breakfast diets. So I looked at sort of a cereal, soy milk, nuts, and then I looked at, some toast and eggs and bacon, and then at something like yogurt and whey protein. And it was amazing because to get the I worked it on 2.5 grams of leucine, and to get that, the cereal breakfast was about 1,300 calories.
Yeah. I mean, an example that I always like to use is one of lysine, an amino acid people don't talk about, but it's probably the single most limiting amino acid in all of the world, lysine. It's always very low in grain products. In grain products, in the United States, plant proteins, wheat makes up 50% of our plant proteins in the United States. So it's a major issue, but it's very deficient in lysine. So the example I like to use, people talk about complementary proteins. So an example of a complementary protein is you can use a wheat bread with, say, with roast beef. And so 1 gram of wheat protein can be totally balanced with 1 gram of beef. You have a complementary pair. You can do the same thing with milk. 1 gram of, say, a wheat cereal can be balanced with 1.5 grams of dairy milk, but it takes 6.5 grams of soy drink to balance it. So you can have a balanced cereal breakfast of amino acids with about 10 grams of total protein, which allows you to have like 6 ounces of milk. But with a soy drink, it takes more than a quart. It takes 33 ounces to balance it. And so there are very few mothers out there that might be thinking about something like soy milk or almond milk or, you know, some type of juice that basically they're giving to their children a totally amino acid imbalanced diet.
So, I mean, that's interesting point too, because one of the things we hear about plant-based diets is you don't need to get all your amino acids in at the same time, that so long as you get them in over the course of a day or two, that's sufficient. Is that, what are your thoughts about that?
There's some truth to that. Part of it sort of diffuses, but something like leucine that we were talking about, that is a meal-to-meal requirement. So if you don't get X amount of the 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine at a meal, you actually asked this question earlier and I forgot it. You basically don't trigger muscle repair and recovery. What happens to all those amino acids? Well, the body prioritizes amino acids to the liver and to the gut and to the heart and other tissues. So those amino acids will get used and you'll maintain those tissues, but slowly over time, your muscles and your bones will get less healthy. And so without that focus on meals, at the amount at each meal, basically you're going to deteriorate your muscle and bones. Your liver and your total body, your kidney, heart, they'll all sort of look okay because that's where the body prioritizes it. As I mentioned earlier, we have to make around 250 grams of protein per day. Of that total amount, only about 25% of it actually goes to all of the muscle. Muscle makes up 50% of all your protein, but it only gets about 25% of your daily turnover. All the rest of it goes to organ tissues. And so that's the reason it is so specific of how we treat muscle. And it's why we see this slow deterioration with aging that we call sarcopenia. It's a slow atrophy of the muscle if we don't take care of it correctly.
And looking after muscle is, obviously a longevity issue, isn't it? If we can't get up and down and walk, well, then sort of life starts to...
I mean, it's mobility, but it's also metabolic health. I mean, insulin resistance, diabetes starts at muscle. If muscle can't use those carbohydrates, we get diabetic. And glucose is one of the most toxic things the body experiences. If muscle's not healthy, we don't burn fatty acids and we get high blood lipids. I mean, muscle is the voluntary sort of secret to having stable metabolism.
You spoke earlier about mTOR, and then we talked about insulin. Does insulin prevent mTOR from working? Is that
Insulin is a trigger for mTOR, and when you're growing, it's a major controlling point. When you stop growing, what we know is insulin just has to be present. If you're a type 1 diabetic, if you're totally devoid of insulin, mTOR won't work. But it doesn't really trigger, I mean, it just has to be present. Baseline insulin is plenty. And in fact, amino acids like leucine actually will stimulate an early bolus, an early response of insulin. So that's enough to trigger it. So insulin's not really required. Insulin actually has a feedback to regulate its own receptor. And so insulin will actually cause insulin resistance, but it doesn't inhibit. Insulin does two main things. One is stimulate glucose, sugar uptake, and the other is stimulating protein synthesis. When we're young, it does both. When we get older, the only thing it really does is regulate glucose uptake.
Right. And so that's why we want to be controlling those carbohydrates as we get older.
I mean, I actually just did the same thing that most people did. I said insulin regulates glucose. The reality is insulin is a fail-safe against high glucose.
Right.
We're best off actually if insulin is never involved. If we have different ways of transporting glucose. For example, in muscle, we have a transporter called GLUT4, which is insulin dependent, but we also have a transporter called GLUT1, which is not. And so we can take up adequate amount of glucose into the muscle without ever having insulin requirement, just really baseline levels. But the reason insulin goes up is to prevent toxicity of glucose in the blood. Type 2 diabetes is an example where insulin can no longer get high enough to get glucose out of the blood, and we start having all the problems of diabetes.
Right. And is GLUT2 as well? Is that an exercise? Is that another non-insulin dependent?
GLUT2, if I remember correctly, GLUT2 is exclusively in brain. So brain is not insulin sensitive.
Right. Okay. Right. So the brain can keep using glucose even when we become insulin resistant.
Right. Glucose is an important brain fuel for the brain and neurons and red blood cells and kidney. And all of those have transporters that are not insulin dependent.
Right. Okay. So some of the other things that we have about protein are protein causes cancer, through the mTOR pathway. Protein causes kidney disease, osteoporosis. Would you speak to that? I know there's been some quite good meta-analysis come out over recent years.
Let's take the latter two first because they're the easiest to reject. The issue of protein and bone, osteoporosis. So that's been totally rejected. The data that made the argument was that on higher protein diets, what we see is more calcium in the urine. And so the argument was, well, protein is causing bone to lose calcium, osteoporosis. However, when Kerstetter and others looked at that and used labeled calcium, what they found out was that protein dramatically increases calcium absorption. And so you're just absorbing a lot more. Under normal circumstances, we only absorb about 20% of the calcium we consume. But in a higher protein diet, we actually increase it up into the 40s. So we're absorbing twice as much, so that just means we lose more of it in the urine. So the bone issue is totally rejected. The kidney issue, the origins of that is that people who have renal failure have to reduce the solute load. So they reduce their salt intake, but they also have to reduce their the urea that they make. This kidney simply can't get rid of anything. And so people will reduce their protein intake. What we know, though, is that only relates to end-stage renal failure. There's a fairly significant debate right even now, even with people who have renal problems, at what point do you decrease protein intake? What we know is that the higher the protein intake, the healthier the kidney stays. It increases the efficiency of what we call the filtration rate, glomerular filtration rate. And so as you reduce your protein intake, the kidney shrinks in size and its capacity shrinks in total capacity. So protein, it's a little like saying exercise makes your heart work harder, so therefore we should never exercise. Protein makes your kidney more efficient. It makes it a little bigger. It makes it more efficient at filtration. It actually makes your kidney healthier. So that has also been rejected. Cancer is the trickier one because it's harder to study. I mean, cancer is some sort of an error that occurs and 20 some years later, it's an error that occurs in DNA, and some 20 years later, you may get a tumor. And so it's hard to study that. What people have done is try to do epidemiology and correlations, and they have found that people, in many cases, that have somewhat higher protein diets seem more likely to get cancers. The problem with that is that the people, particularly in the United States, who fall into that category of higher protein also have higher calorie intake, higher glucose intake, less vegetable intake, smoke more, drink more, exercise less. And so we're concluding that protein was the problem when in fact the entire lifestyle is a problem. And I would argue that if you control for calories and carbohydrate, you'll never find protein related to cancer or heart disease.
Does insulin play a role? I mean, in these cancers, is that, could that be another?
Insulin, I actually did a study with a breast cancer model. And so we looked at a high protein, low carb versus a high protein versus a low protein, high carb. And the argument was that IGF-1 is a big stimulus for tumor development. And so we did that study, and what we found was that insulin is actually a bigger impact on IGF-1 than protein amount. And so I frankly think that insulin and carbohydrates are the driving force for cancers. Insulin is one of the most inflammatory issues that we see. It's one of the reasons why we're finding that huge numbers of the COVID-19 deaths relate to obesity and diabetes. Insulin is one of the worst possible issues for your immune system.
Yeah, and we've sort of got a obesity and diabetes pandemic around the world, don't we? So
yeah, I mean it's huge in basically every developed country, and we all have excess calories available to us, and that has led to huge problems with insulin sensitivity. But it's not protein. In fact, if you look in the United States, protein's been about constant for the last 50 years in the United States, and yet we have huge epidemics of obesity and diabetes in the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and that's been with the introduction of the food guidelines, really.
Yeah, it's junk food. Looking at RN Haynes data, people talk about plant-based diets. We get 70% of our calories from plant-based foods now, but 80% of those calories come from added fats, oils, sugars, and refined grains. It's all highly processed plant foods that go into junk foods.
I know you're quite interested in the evolutionary sort of nature of how we evolved to eat. Would you like to speak a bit about that? It's probably a good time for that.
Oh, wow. Hadn't really thought about that. I think that there are a lot of people that talk about paleo and carnivore diets and things like that. I think the simplest way to think about it is what we have learned to do in the last, post-World War II, is to create a lot of highly processed foods that have extreme calorie density. We've learned a lot about how to develop very savory foods, chips and crackers and candies and processed foods that have lots of oils and fats and sugars in them. And we've basically figured out ways to kind of deceive our sensory tastes. We learned basically, and there's some great work by Steve Simpson out of Australia about the protein leverage hypothesis, that basically humans and animals all eat toward a protein target. But what we've done with our food supply is create foods that deceive our taste and our senses. And so now what we do is we tend to overeat calories while we're searching for that protein content. It's one of the reasons that I always talk about create your meal around protein first, because that's where you get your satiety. When we talk with people in our weight loss clinic, we tell them that the first thing they have to eat at any meal always has to be protein first. They can't eat anything that resembles carbs until after they've eaten some protein.
So do you think then that protein leverage theory could be partly why, people or contribute to our obesity problem? People are just eating and eating. I mean, there's that sort of neurotransmitter sort of aspect of the food, or the dopamine triggers, but also just this need to actually get enough protein. Could that be?
I really do. I really like the theory. I've done enough animal work and I've done enough human satiety work that I really do think that protein has a unique satiety to it. And, whether we're biologically eating toward a target like they say, I think it makes good sense. I like the theory. And one of the things we know is people tend not to overeat protein. You'll find athletes who are taking huge amounts of supplements, but if you just let people eat to their own desire, almost everyone will stop eating protein. 100, 120 grams. It's really, we all know that you go out and eat a meal and you get to the point you're basically full, and the last thing you want is somebody to bring you another steak. But if somebody brings out chocolate cake, you're ready to eat it. We can always eat carbs, but nobody eats extra protein.
Well, that's a really good point, because lots of people ask me about, well, can I overeat protein? What's too high? Is that a worry? So
I think that, there's people who go out, I like to use the example of the businessman on his expense account who 4 nights a week goes to a steakhouse. That guy is probably overeating. But if you just do it within normal diets and normal meals, people will stop automatically on their protein consumption. I just don't think there's any way people will overeat. And in fact, we find that with women, we almost have to force them to eat enough protein. They will stop so quickly. They just don't desire to eat it. And I just don't think there's the only way of eating huge amounts of protein is with a lot of shakes and supplement kinds of things. The athletes go to that. If they're trying to stuff in, 3.0 grams per kg, they go to shakes, because you can't eat that much food.
Yeah. I'll come back I'd like to talk to you about athletes in a moment, but I just wanted to raise a bit of a question, just coming back to sort of vegan or plant proteins and dipeptides like carnosine and carnitine and things like that. Is our ability to make those limited on a vegan diet, because they require some of the essential amino acids, don't they?
Yeah, the creatinine is basically coming out of predominantly arginine, and the carnitine is coming out of lysine. And so, as I mentioned earlier, these sort of things that are metabolic driven, substrate driven, if we eat low diets, then, we'll see problems with those. If you look at arginine supplements, for example, if you look in the literature, arginine, which controls nitric oxide, can be used for blood pressure at times. And if you look in the literature, about 1 out of 12 subjects will get a benefit from an arginine supplement. And the reason for that is because that's about how many are low protein diets. And if you look at carnitine supplementation and weight loss, you'll find 1 or 2 out of 10 might get us a benefit of carnitine, lysine supplementation or carnitine supplementation, either one. And basically that's because they're on low protein diets. And so, if you're low enough, you'll meet that minimum requirements or the building block of protein, but all these other metabolic processes get down-regulated. And so you may need supplements for all of them.
Because I do wonder about, the mitochondria and our Krebs cycle and, how we produce energy, whether that gets down-regulated as well when we're a bit low in protein. Is that, or is that one of the processes that is maintained?
Yeah, mitochondria in the muscles probably most dependent on your activity level. Right. But we do know that protein affects thermogenic activity, that protein produces more heat than carbohydrates or fat. Carbohydrate and fat, we lose about 5% of the calories to heat, where with protein, it's 15 to 20. People have debated what that effect is over the years. I think it is basically an effect of stimulating protein synthesis in muscle. That effect dramatically will lower the ATP levels in muscle. And so that requires mitochondria to stimulate it. So protein does enhance metabolic energy expenditure in muscle.
So that raises another important question, really, although you did answer it earlier when you said it's very difficult to overeat protein, but we don't store protein as, well, how do we store protein in the body? We don't store it as fat. We use some in gluconeogenesis, but it's not really stored.
There's some misconceptions about that out there in terms of how we use protein. I like to always start with thinking of a 45-year-old person. A 45-year-old person is basically in protein maintenance. So we're not gaining weight, we're not losing weight, muscle, everything's sort of stable. So that means every gram of protein you eat per day, whether it's 60 grams or 160 grams, you have to burn.
Yeah.
Every part of it goes to energy. Okay, and so of the 20 amino acids, 16 of them are gluconeogenic. They all produce glucose. So if you're for easy numbers, if you're eating 100 grams of protein per day, you will make 60 grams of glucose from it. And the rest gets metabolized as a fatty acid. So leucine is one of the branch chain amino acids. They get metabolized as fats. So anyway, all of the amino acids are energy sources. But what's different is that glucose after a meal, you absolutely have to dispose of all of that glucose within 2 hours, or that's a definition of diabetes. You will have tissue damage. Where protein after a meal, the body disposes of it much slower. 5, 6, 7 hours, you'll actually have elevated blood levels. And so the body doesn't dispose of it very quickly. So that's a huge difference. So we're converting glucose or converting amino acids into glucose at a very slow rate, where if it comes in as carbohydrates in a meal, you're exposed to it very quickly. You have to have an acute insulin response, and it's a huge stress on the body.
And so that's why carbohydrates are not an essential requirement in our diet, because we can make all the glucose that we need from the protein.
Yeah, we can make it. If you look in all of the nutritional guidelines, they'll quickly tell you that there is no absolute requirement for carbohydrates because we can make it. But they then say, because of these obligatory glucose tissues, the brain, the neurons, the red blood cells, we believe that the body is probably best off if it has 80 to 90 grams of glucose per day. And they put a little bit of a safety factor on that. So we actually have an RDA of 130 grams of carbohydrates per day, which is a pretty good number. I mean, with 130 grams, you can have 5 servings of vegetables, 3 servings of fruit, and 3 servings of whole grain, 130 grams. But the average American is eating over 300 grams, 3 times that energy requirement. It's no wonder we're obese.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point. I mean, and that's a lot of food, that amount of carbohydrates along with your protein.
Yeah.
And you've got fat.
And that's one of the problems with plant foods. If you use native plant, whole, beans and legumes and things like that, basically you're looking at a carbohydrate to protein ratio of about 4 to 1. So if your target is 100 grams of protein, that means you have to eat 400 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot of calories. And so it's very hard to be a pure vegetarian, a vegan, and be on the higher side of protein. So, if you're committing to be a vegan, then you have to commit to the high level of exercise just to protect your body structures.
Okay. And what about supplements for vegans? Do you think supplements are useful?
If I was going to counsel a vegan, I would definitely recommend supplements. I think that they definitely need the extra protein. And so they have to decide. The problem with supplements is now you're talking about ultra-processed food. And so you've got this problem where most vegans are trying to have natural food sources, but now you have to have ultra-processed foods to get to it. And, so there's kind of this dichotomy to it. And so typically what you see is that vegans are extremely low carbohydrate. extremely low protein. In the United States, if you look at the demographics of vegans, it's typically between about 17 and 45. Most vegans find it's very hard to maintain a healthy lifestyle as you get older with that lower protein.
And we've got to differentiate between real vegans who are doing what you're saying, eating, unprocessed whole foods, and then just people who are eating the standard sort of Western diet, but not eating meat.
Right.
There's quite a...
Right. So, a lot of people consider themselves vegetarian if they don't eat red meat. And so you can eat, fish and eggs and milk and chicken or whatever, maybe that falls into your definition, and that can be perfectly healthy. So, if that's your definition, fine. But the problem in the United States is, like I already said, we get 70% of our calories from plant-based foods, but they're awful. Our number one vegetable is French fries. The number two is tomato sauce, ketchup, and the number three is lettuce. So 2/3 of our vegetables have no nutritional value.
Yeah,
so the comment I always like making is we don't need a more plant-based diet. We need a diet with better plants.
Yeah. The animal welfare concerns and the environment concerns are pretty huge. We've got a program being run through our schools now, which I've had a look at the resource and teaching material. And they're really advocating, skipping meat, meatless days, plant-based nutrition. What are your thoughts, with the protein intakes that we've talked about? Does that need to be every day, or can we skip days and it doesn't matter? Or is that, again, going to be an age-dependent thing? As we get older, it becomes more important.
There's a lot of aspects to how to answer that. In the United States, our USDA does school lunch surveys, for example, and the number one thing thrown away in the trash is vegetables. Well over 40% of all vegetables served in school lunch are thrown into the trash, where under 15% of meats are thrown away. So we know that children just don't like it. Okay, so that's not a good thing. If skipping school lunch because they don't like it, that's not a good direction. We also know that in New York City, for example, they went to Meatless Monday, and it turned out that the mayor of New York was paid $30,000 by Impossible Burger for a Meatless Monday coalition. So basically, he was paid to downgrade the diet of children in New York, and he took the money. If we look at all of that in context, the bottom line for something like Meatless Monday and the environment is pretty much irrelevant. In an industrial country like the United States, greenhouse gas is almost all fossil fuels. Almost 85% of greenhouse gas comes from fossil fuels in the United States. Livestock produce around 4% of our total. So Meatless Monday is in the third decimal place of our greenhouse gas production. So it's pretty much an irrelevant number. Transportation is by far the biggest in the United States with electricity. New Zealand is a little different in that you have a lot less people than we have and a lot more animals. But if you look around New Zealand or a lot of the United States, we have huge tracts of land that are grassland. And animals, particularly ruminant animals, are particularly good at using that land and that grass to produce high quality foods. And you can't convert, a lot of the grassland in New Zealand or in the United States, in North Dakota and Montana, you can't convert that into making avocados and broccoli. They're grassland, only suitable for dairy or beef raising. And so as we look at food systems, we have to have a far more comprehensive understanding of where all of the parts fit together. And animals are a critical part of how we assimilate a complete diet that provides the nutrient density that we need for healthy lives.
And I think there's a lot of work being done in the regenerative farming area, you know, that's really addressing a lot of the, you know, the environmental and animal welfare concerns. So, you know, I think we'll only go forward from here.
I think animal welfare has been around as a comment for a long time, but I grew up on a farm in Illinois in the United States, and farmers take care of their animals. I mean, if animals aren't healthy, if they're not happy, they don't grow well. It's not a good economic situation. So anybody who thinks animals are mistreated just has never been on a farm. I mean, I'm sure you can go out and find some unethical farmer somewhere, but that's not the norm by any stretch. So I sort of reject the ethical aspects of it. In terms of efficiency of farming, I think there's a lot of stuff we can do to continue to look at that. We know, for example, in the United States, comparing the United States to India, for example, it takes 10 cows in India to produce the same amount of milk in the US. And I would assume that's about the same in New Zealand, which is also efficient. We probably have somewhat higher grain use in the United States than New Zealand, just because we have a lot more grain acreage than what I think New Zealand has.
Yes, we don't sort of contain our animals in barns and then grow crops to feed them. We, you know, they're out on the, you know, I mean, which is great. I mean, it's a huge opportunity for New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is efficiency, and the more grain that the animals consume, the longer the milking period, but more importantly, the less greenhouse gas they produce. The more roughage, the more grasses that they consume, the more fermentation goes on and the higher the greenhouse gas. So there's this trade-off that I'm not sure what the right balance is. I think that's still, you know, that's an important research area. But, you know, how far do you go on the efficiency category versus the more grass-fed kind of category? So how do you balance those two? And I don't think there's a pure answer. And frankly, I think each country may be different. I think the answer in New Zealand might be different than the answer in the United States, just because of our territory and our farming, our climate and our farming capabilities.
And also your population base too, you know.
Yeah, and the fact that we have 330 million people and you have 5, you know, it's a different no, it's a different scale.
It is definitely a different scale. So I want to be respectful of your time, but I'd really like to just touch on athletes and performance and protein and nutrition needs for athletes, if that's okay.
Sure.
Have a chat about
athletes. Yeah. So far we've been kind of talking about keeping adults healthy. And so we've been talking about how to get enough protein in an environment where the general calorie value is going down. They just can't handle as much calories as they get older. Now we switch to an athlete who has really high calorie demands and are probably trying to increase, at the very least, the strength of their muscles and maybe even the mass of their muscles. So now we go into how do we create an anabolic period. So for muscle building and athletes trying to grow and develop, we frequently argue that they should have 4 meals per day where they're getting at least the 30 grams of protein, up to 3 grams of leucine, because we're trying when you have a protein meal, the anabolic period only lasts about 2 hours. And so if we're having an anabolic meal and we're only doing that once a day, say at dinner, we only have 1 meal that reaches 30 grams. That means we're spending 22 hours a day in a catabolic period. That's aging. And so the reason we want more meals is we want more anabolic periods. And so the athlete is going to try and maximize that. I know athletes who get up in the middle of the night and take a protein shake at 3 in the morning because they're trying to maximize those anabolic periods. And so, we would recommend for an athlete trying to gain muscle that they try and have at least 3 and maybe 4 meals a day that hit those 30-gram thresholds. One of those probably right after their exercise period. And we would like to see them spaced at least 4 hours apart.
Okay, so that's quite a lot. That's a long feeding window and quite a lot of food. When I was, studying nutrition way back, over long ago, we were always taught that you needed within 20 minutes to 2 hour feeding window, and that it needed to have carbohydrates with your protein, for that insulin to help uptake the amino acids. Is that still standard sort of?
Yeah, it really isn't true. So carbohydrate and protein. So the insulin effect for amino acid uptake, amino acids themselves generate enough insulin to take care of uptake. Baseline levels of insulin are totally adequate. So you don't need it for that purpose. The carbohydrate aspect relates to the type of exercise you're doing. So if you're doing, the higher the intensity, the more carbohydrates you need. So people who are doing just long distance running need a lot of energy, but they could get it from either fat or carbohydrates. People who are doing more intense exercise, for example, elite tennis players, they probably use quite a bit of carbohydrate because everything is sudden bursts of activity. And so, you need to kind of think about the carbohydrate and protein parts as different parts. They have different purposes, but you don't need them together, really. As far as the amount of protein, generally most of the exercise literature will say that endurance athletes should be in sort of the 1.2 to 1.6, and the strength building athletes should be more in the 1.4 to 1.8 range. But a lot of muscle building athletes will go up to 2.5 grams per kg. So again, one of the things, if you're trying to build muscle, you almost have to be in positive calorie balance. It's very difficult to be losing weight and building muscle. Can be done, but it really takes a unique training process. So most people who are trying to gain mass will also be eating quite a lot of food, and hence you can have more protein.
Right. So for an athlete, I'm thinking in particular at the moment about slalom, canoe slalom athletes. So they have sort of 90-second races, quite explosive.
Yep.
And then they do quite a lot of training. They'll train a couple of times a day. They'll train in the gym. And then, so they want to build strength, build explosive power.
Right.
They also want to maintain body weight. So what kind of suggestions would you have for someone like that?
So I'm not an expert in canoe racing, but my understanding is they probably also do heats where they'll do maybe more than one race in a day.
Yes, correct.
And so again, these are explosive races. So these are going to be very heavily glycogen oriented. So these are athletes who are definitely they're going to want to develop the strength. So they need the protein in their training, but they're also going to be carbohydrate oriented because they have to have that explosive energy. And so sprinters, the world-class sprinters, they're very carbohydrate oriented too, because the world-class 100-meter sprinters basically don't breathe during the race. It's a 9-second race, and it's basically all on ATP, creatine phosphate, and glycogen. They basically don't breathe till they cross the finish line. There's nothing aerobic about it. And a 90-second canoe race, that's going to be almost all done on glycogen.
Right. So they're going to really need to focus on their carbohydrate and their protein intakes.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna be working on their, aerobic capacity, but really it's going to be strength and explosive power is what they're going to be looking for. And so, they're an athlete like a tennis player who will be fairly carbohydrate oriented.
Okay. And so then alternatively, you spoke about the endurance athletes. So the endurance athletes can use fatty acids for energy.
So so the training of an endurance athlete is to build up mitochondria, to build up their red blood cells so that they can continuously deliver oxygen. Because as soon as you go into oxygen debt, like in a canoe race, you have to quit. I mean, the lactic acid will build up, and those guys doing a 90-second race, if you said, well, it's going to be a 10-minute race this time, they would simply die. I mean, they can't do it. But the endurance athletes are building up their mitochondria, the red blood cells, so they can deliver oxygen and they can sustain it. What we've seen now in the last 10 years or so is people like marathon runners or Tour de France. Those guys now take in carbohydrates. They will have these gels and things. So they will just sort of titrate in carbohydrates all the time so that they can kind of maintain that high level. There's a crossover between fat use and carbohydrate use, somewhere around 60% of VO2 max. So when you get to about that level, if you're less than that, so you're out walking or jogging, you're basically a fat user. You're using that as fuel. Carbohydrates are very low. You and I sitting here are probably using 80% fats and 20% carbohydrates max. Okay, go out and start walking, that sort of starts coming together. Somewhere around, for an athlete, maybe 140 beats per minute heart rate, they'll get a crossover. And now it's mostly carbohydrates. And as it keeps going. And so an elite athlete is going to try and maintain, heart rate of 180 beats per minute or higher. And they'll be maintaining 85% VO2 max. And they're going to do this for 4 hours. They will titrate in some carbohydrates as they do that. And that's kind of what they're training to do. But it's still mostly mostly fat energy that they're using.
Right. Okay. But then that doesn't cross over to the general population, just for general population people who are listening.
I mean, a typical person, for me, I'm a tennis player. My VO2 max, my 60% range is probably more around 120 beats per minute now, where an elite athlete might be 160. A 20-year-old elite athlete, because the older you get, that number keeps going down.
Yeah. So what about these athletes, bodybuilders, power lifters, CrossFitters who are doing carnivore or, really, really low carb diets? What do you?
I mean, so they're looking at high protein, and they're also trying to control calories. And they're also trying to keep carbohydrates low. Carbohydrates, because of the glycogen things, will put on more water weight. And so athletes will lose the definition. Their muscles will look softer. And so if you're looking at bodybuilders or people looking for body sculpting, basically they'll always be low carb because it takes the glycogen away and it takes a lot of the water weight away.
Right. Okay. And what about our muscle stores of glycogen? We store what do we store, like about 300 grams or something? Is that right?
I always forget that number, but it's something like that, yeah.
and so that can only be used by the muscle, can't it? We can't extract that out and use it.
Well, that's kind of a misnomer. First thing about muscle glycogen, because of the branch structure, we only use about 50% of it during an activity, because we can kind of use the chains. It's kind of like the branches of a tree, and you can kind of use it down to the branch points. And after that, you can't use it very well. So if you're lost in the woods and starving for a week, you'll slowly use it. But if you're thinking about acute exercise, you can only use it down to the branch points. Same as in the liver. Overnight, we can use about 50% max of our glycogen stores just because of the branch points. The use of glycogen, as it breaks down, the muscle can't release glucose directly into the blood. But what we do is we use the glucose down to a molecule known as pyruvate through glycolysis. We get the ATP out of it. And when it gets there, we can then release it back into the blood as either alanine or lactic acid. It goes back to the liver, and the liver can remake it into glucose, gluconeogenesis. And basically, the evidence is that in an exercise like a long distance bike race, about 40% of blood glucose is coming from recycled glycogen.
Okay, but that would
So
be
you can get glucose from glycogen back into the blood, but it's through the process of gluconeogenesis from pyruvate, lactate, and back.
So that would be a fairly slow process, wouldn't it?
It takes more than an hour before that really gets geared up. So if you're talking about activities that are less than an hour, basically you're just using glycogen at that point, and you'll actually accumulate the lactic acid. Right. And so, high-end athletes will get muscle cramps because they've accumulated too much lactate and they can't get rid of it fast enough.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to just flip back to our general population again and just ask you, we touched on feeding our children, but I know all around the world and in New Zealand, we have a huge issue with the health of our children. Where our diabetes in our kids is increasing by 3 to 5% per annum. It's just horrifying, really. Overweight and obesity. Have you got any thoughts, recommendations for parents about feeding their kids?
Well, based on, I don't study children other than my own, but the issues in the United States are pretty widely accepted that we've got lower physical activity, a lot more screen time, and kids snack in front of them. And so they're eating, very poor quality nutrition, energy dense things with very little physical activity. And so one has to correct those kinds of lifestyle patterns. And is it because we're just planting kids in front of screens as a babysitter? Or is it because it's not safe outside? There's all kinds of reasons that lead to that. But the bottom line is they're eating poor quality food, and we're basically exposing them to more of it with things like meatless Mondays. And we're not getting them enough exercise, enough physical activity. So, those are the issues, and I think the evidence for it's pretty clear. So how do you tackle those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's the $60 million question, isn't it? How do we tackle it? But I guess if we talk about it, at least that's a start anyway.
The physical activity is a huge thing. Kids are, designed to be out running and playing and running around and burning lots of calories, and then they can eat all kinds of things. But if they sit in front of screens all day, now their calorie needs are pretty low. And so are they getting nutrient dense foods? And now we got people believing that milk's bad for you. So they're eating these soy drinks and almond drinks and things that have virtually no protein in them. And they're eating, chips and crisps and candies and all kinds of things that have no vitamins and minerals to speak of. So we've lowered the nutrient density. We've increased the calories, and we've decreased the activity. So of course we've got problems.
So my sort of last question to you is, actually, I know you're not a medical doctor, but how do we get our GP in providing better nutritional advice and getting away from food to the...
our internet connection's breaking up a little bit. We're getting some pauses. I didn't actually hear the question. Can you hear me? Our connection seems to have frozen.
GPs and get some support for.
Okay, so our connection seemed to have gotten bad there, and I missed the entire question.
Sorry, I think we had a bit of a glitch in the
yeah, our internet has gotten overloaded.
We've been going too long. It's telling us it's time to wind up. Did you hear my question?
I'm sorry, I didn't. I really didn't hear the question.
I was talking about how do we talk to our doctors about supporting nutritional changes. I think they are a real key in going forward to resolving this problem. And how do we get away from just keeping on recommending these dietary guidelines?
Yeah. The problem in medical schools is that physicians really have very little nutrition training. And so what they're told is either hospital standard of care or what they hear from pharmaceutical companies. The American Heart Association for years has taken lots of money from pharmaceuticals companies to keep perpetuating the myth about cholesterol. And you still hear people, doctors, who don't realize that dietary cholesterol has nothing to do with blood cholesterol. We still have people who believe saturated fat is the major problem, when in fact, the primary saturated fats in the blood come from carbohydrates being made into palmitate. We just have a huge amount of misinformation in the medical community, and they simply don't get it. And so I don't know. I think that consumers are going to have to realize that the medical community, the normal doctor, is not a good source of nutrition. And they're going to have to look for other places to get it. And that's a real problem now. I mean, it's hard to figure out where the charlatans are in the social media world that we're now in.
Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything else you would like to say, or that I haven't covered or asked you, or?
Wow, we covered a lot of grounds. Let me think about. I think the misinformation relative to the environment, relative to the diet, and all of those things, we have to recognize that in the food arena, the least money is made on fresh foods. Least money is made with vegetables, with fruits, with dairy, with eggs, with meats. The most money is made with ultra-processed foods and that come from grains. And so when you look at the arguments, one of the things you always need to look at is follow the money. And what you'll find is all of the government-based guidelines are heavily influenced by food companies that are selling processed foods. I mean, when was the last time you saw a commercial for broccoli? When was the last time you saw a good commercial for blueberries, or, those kinds of things? There's no money in it. They have high spoilage, they have high transportation costs, they have high refrigeration costs. Everybody would rather sell highly processed things. And so that's one of the things the consumer has to be sensitive to. I think all nutritionists would agree we'd be better off if we ate more vegetables, but that's not what the food industry is selling.
Yeah, really, really good points. I was given a Good Housekeeping magazine or something the other day by someone, and on one page it's telling us reduce our dairy intake, reduce our meat intake. On the next page it's advertising muesli bars as being, and
I mean, the statistic in the United States is from 1975 to 2010. The United States reduced its milk, eggs and beef consumption by over 30% in all three categories. And we had epidemic increases in obesity and diabetes. And we had a 400 calorie increase in junk food per day. So basically, as we took the animal foods out, as people said we should for cholesterol and saturated fat, across the board, the American diet got worse. So the arguments simply are baseless in terms of reducing milk or eggs or meats.
And a lot of these cereal companies are, you know, tax-free because they are part of, you know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I know, in Australia and New Zealand. So, you know, I mean, there's, like you said, there's, without being a conspiracy theorist, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I mean, I think I don't have a problem with people following their cultural or religious beliefs, but to imply a moral superiority about that is simply unacceptable from a scientific standpoint. The science just doesn't support it.
All right. Well, you have given us a lot to think about today, and I think this is going to be incredibly useful for people to listen to. I'm sure that they'll have to listen to it a couple of times.
Sure, certainly.
to pick up some of the points, because you know, protein is quite complex, and you know how we use it, and you know, you've spent a lifetime studying it, so you know that's how complex it is.
Yeah, so if anybody would like to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Don Layman, and I'm actually doing a webinar, a free webinar with the National Dairy Council on June 11th. So if you pick it up on Twitter, you can sign up for it if somebody wants to follow and learn a little more about protein.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Would I be able to get the details of that from you? Are you able?
Yeah, I can send you a link to that. But like I said, you can also find it on my Twitter feed. But I can send you a link to the National Dairy Council registration.
That would be fantastic, and I'll put that on my website and on the show notes of this as well. And is there anywhere else people can find you? So I've got your Twitter account, which I'll post, but do you do any other social media, Facebook or? I
don't. One of my colleagues is Gabrielle Lyon, and she and I are actually developing a website and a teaching program. So hopefully, maybe by the end of the year, we're going to actually open that up. So again, if people follow me on Twitter, I have an Instagram account, but I don't use it. But you know, if you follow me, you'll sort of see that over time. But yeah, we hopefully have to your point earlier, where can people find information? We're actually going to open up a website that actually is available to the public to follow, and hopefully will give them another source of finding credible information. My colleague Gabrielle is a physician in New York City, so she has a personal health clinic there, and so she and I have worked together for over 20 years, and so it's a good combination. We're looking forward to it.
I'm familiar with Gabrielle, so I will endeavour to keep in touch with what you're doing with that, and make sure that you know, our New Zealand audience can.
She and I have a lot of YouTube things out right now, and are producing some more. So that, you know, tracking me through her would also be another way. Most of those things are all under her Lion feed at this point.
Okay, well, I will go and see if I can track some of those down, and put some links to those as well, so people can follow. And I think this is the kind of information people need to hear over again, and from different perspectives, you know, to really. And
you know, as you said, I'm a protein expert, so I think about it differently. I also come out of an agricultural background. I grew up on a farm. I was associate dean of the College of Agriculture at the University of Illinois. I have a broad food background, so I just have a different perspective on it. And I have studied the environmental parts, the protein parts, the animal parts. I just have a different knowledge than most people can ever get.
Yeah, a very different perspective and very valuable. And you do a lot of consultation with food and nutrition industry as well, don't you? So
Yeah, I've worked with most of the major food companies from Kraft and Nestle's. I work with all the commodity groups, and you know, if it relates to protein, I've probably worked with them at some point in time.
oh, that's fantastic. All right, well, thank you so much for your very generous time.
It was
And
my pleasure. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to getting back to New Zealand sometime.